would be honoured if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, but as always, that's pretty much all you need to know about me. I'm going to take us back to the 1980s, the early 1980s, to a hugely popular, if troublesome, movie sequel. Here's a clip to get you in the mood.
If I offended you, then I am sorry.
Ah, dessert. Chilled monkey brain.
Well, if it's all the same with you, I think I'll skip the dinner. That was 1984's Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, the sequel, of course, to Raiders of the Lost Ark. Harrison Ford reprising the title role, Steven Spielberg directing, George Lucas producing. And going back to Spielberg, this is one of a few, just a bare few of his films really, that he's spoken particularly critically of over time. The most prominent film that he's had words about is Hook. He infamously did an interview with Mark Herbert and Simon Mayo on their radio show where he talked about one day he might go back to Hook and find something he really liked in it, but the director considers that particular film a disappointment, although to many people Hook is pretty beloved. The other film, though, I distinctly remember him expressing disappointment over is how Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom turned out. In particular, how dark it turned out. I'm revisiting the film for a few years ago, the first time I'd watched it in quite a while. It really is quite a dark and disturbing movie, considering it was going to a pretty family audience. It was also the first sequel that Steven Spielberg had agreed to make. It wasn't the first sequel to one of his films, Jaws 2, of course, and 3 and 4. But this was the first time he agreed to direct. George Lucas had originally envisaged, as the story goes, a trilogy of Indiana Jones films, and he came up with the key ingredients for what he wanted in Temple of Doom. And those key ingredients were child slavery, human sacrifice, and religion. These were not particular ingredients that appealed to screenwriter Lawrence Kasdan, who'd penned the original Raiders of the Lost Ark. Kasdan would fairly quickly decline to take part in Temple of Doom, and in fact he was taught, when quoted about the film, he said, "I thought it was horrible. It's so mean. There's nothing pleasant about it. I think Temple of Doom represents a chaotic period in both their lives," and he's talking about Spielberg and Lucas, and I'll come to them shortly, "and the movie is very ugly and mean-spirited." So in the end, the script ended up in the hands of Gloria Katz and Willard Hook. Now, Hook we talked about on last issue, the last edition of Film Stories, when we were talking about Howard the Duck, a film that he would eventually direct. But in the case of Temple of Doom, he was co-writer, and they put the screenplay together as per the ingredients that George Lucas had envisaged. Now, going back to what Lawrence Kasdan said about the dark period in Lucas and Spielberg's lives and how that impacted the production of Temple of Doom and certainly the tone of the story, it was no secret that Lucas wasn't in the best of places. So there was a weighted biography of him a few years ago which charted this and charted it quite delicately and rightly so. But his marriage at this stage was falling apart and his moods were a bit darker. And the thinking is really that was reflected in the story that he wanted Temple of Doom to tell. He wanted it to go to darker places. He wanted to try different things. And he would admit that he didn't come up with a great MacGuffin for the film, but he would also admit that he was happier with the end result than Spielberg was. Again, we'll come to that shortly. Spielberg himself wasn't in a great place. His marriage his first marriage hadn't ended successfully, and also this contextually, this was all coming together around the time of the tragedy on the set of Twilight Zone, the movie, a film that Spielberg was involved in the production of, and this was the on-set accident that killed 2 children and the actor Vic Morrow. Now, to be absolutely clear, Spielberg wasn't on the set or charged, but nonetheless, it was a production he was involved with, and there were ramifications and consequences, and it was a part of his life. I'm pretty sure he carried quite heavily on. He carried quite heavily around in his head. He would have felt the impact of it. And so you had the two the key creatives, the two brains really behind the Indiana Jones films coming together on a sequel, and neither of them were in the best place. It's worth reiterating that Indiana Jones is George Lucas's creation, that Lucas is the author of the character, but it was very much a partnership with Spielberg directing, and the peak of the partnership of the two of them was Raiders, I would argue. The screenplay was put together, and it was, in fact, the screenplay, as the story goes, would make it relatively intact to the screen as well. The script was finally finished to people's satisfaction in April 1983, and this was a week or two before shooting was scheduled to begin. George Lucas at the time wasn't only juggling the falling apart of his marriage, he was also juggling the final part of his original Star Wars trilogy, Return of the Jedi, and Return of the Jedi's release was fast coming just as Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was heading into production. This was a period where Lucas had come to the end of his time in his head on Star Wars, that he'd carried Star Wars around for a long time, that he was keen to conclude the story. He felt that the exercise in pushing the boulder uphill had come to a natural end for him, and as such, he was involved with some of the early second unit work on Indiana Jones the Temple of Doom, but he was pretty exhausted, and he was ready to step away, as we'll come to shortly. The early filming on Indiana Jones the Temple of Doom took place in Hong Kong, and this was second unit stunt work, and Vic Armstrong, who had worked on the first film, would come in and be stunt coordinator on Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Vic Armstrong's also Harrison Ford's stunt double, and he's charted quite a lot of his stories in his own memoir, which is well worth a read, actually, The True Stories of the World's Greatest Stuntman, because he goes into quite a lot of the technicals of how he came up with the stunts, some of the on-set challenges, his thoughts of how, for instance, the stunts in James Bond films have evolved. His thoughts on Die Another Day are worth reading. Perhaps that's one we'll come back to at a later point. He was working alongside a guy called Glenn Randall, who had been the stunt coordinator on Raiders of the Lost Ark, but this time Armstrong had elevated that to that position, and he concedes in his book that there was some difficulty between the pair of them. He does also say that they ended up firm friends, but at this particular point in their life, it was clearly quite awkward. The shoot nonetheless carried on. They went to Singapore, and then they went to Sri Lanka, and the infamous rope bridge sequence. I mean, just watching this sequence now, even today, makes me all woozy. Spielberg, notoriously afraid of heights, kept saying throughout the production that he would go on the rope bridge and walk across this rickety bridge. Whether he actually ever did so or not is unknown. Armstrong certainly did, though, and he talked about the expense of putting that rope bridge together, that it looks like such a rickety bridge when we see it on screen, but actually it could hold pretty much the whole production team. Not that I'd imagine the whole production team all wanted to stand on it at the same time. When it came to the key sequence, though, I don't think it's a massive spoiler to say the bridge doesn't really make it intact, and they had one chance to get that right. As with many key practical stunts in films where they're not using miniatures, and even in some instances where they are using miniatures, it is a one shot, and that is it. And they did, in fact, get the shot and the sequences in the film, and looks terrific. And with that in mind, the film could decamp back to London for the bulk of its studio filming. But when the production got to London, there were a couple of problems. Matters with Glenn Randall and Vic Armstrong came to a head. Armstrong admits that he issued an ultimatum, and perhaps less an ultimatum, but more said that he was willing to walk away from the picture, that it was untenable for the two of them to work together. Randall in the end would depart the film, and thankfully their story has a happy ending because now they're friends, although Armstrong does concede it was quite awkward for a while. The bigger physical problem facing the production, though, was Harrison Ford. Ford had been carrying around a back injury for a little while, and it had plagued him in some of the scenes that they'd shot thus far. But when they got to London, things got worse. That his back effectively seized up, and it was clear that Ford couldn't continue filming in that state. He had to return home to America to get it properly treated and to get it properly fixed. And in fact, the diagnosis, as Ford would discover, was a herniated disc. The producers at this time were looking at a 2-month shutdown for the film, a film that they wanted to get out in the summer of the following year. And it was there that Vic Armstrong came in, and Harrison Ford says this, and Steven Spielberg says this, and George Lucas says that Armstrong pretty much saved the day on Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Because what they did was they shot around for around 2 months. I mean, what's that, half the production? For around 2 months, they shot around the fact that their leading man was not on set, that he was getting treatment on a back thousands of miles away. And what they did is they utilised Armstrong's skills as a stuntman and Armstrong's skills as Harrison Ford's stunt double. So an awful lot of what you see, far more than usual, that you see in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, when you do see the character of Indy, you are actually seeing, particularly when you're seeing the character's back, you're seeing Vic Armstrong, you're not seeing Harrison Ford. And it was only when Ford was able to return towards the end of production that Spielberg could then shoot the necessary face close-ups that were required to marry the film together. And of course, as is the way, these things are all pieced together in the editing room, and it looks relatively seamless. But it is worth keeping an eye on, because for a sizable amount of the film, it's an Indiana Jones film without Harrison Ford in it on screen as Indiana Jones. The movie was eventually finished in August of 1983, and post-production continued, and then things were going relatively smoothly up till the point where it was submitted to the Motion Picture Association of America to get its rating. The expectation was, as per Raiders of the Lost Ark, that Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom would be awarded a very family-friendly PG certificate, but the MPAA had at this stage other ideas, that they were pretty understandably, I'd say, quite torn on what to do, because the PG rating was, in its strange way, deemed too soft for the film, but also, was it really harsh enough to warrant the only other alternative, which was an R? And the MPAA did eventually relent. They did, even though the film was advertised with fairly significant warnings as to the material within it, it went out into cinemas with a PG rating on it, and this family-friendly rating was reflected in most territories around the world. For the MPAA, this would be this and Gremlins actually would be something of a turning point. I think it's a pretty well-known story that between the pair of them, they led the MPAA to create the PG-13 rating that we know and oh do we love today. But at that stage, Indiana Jones went out with a far softer certificate on it. Spielberg, in the midst of it all, would look back and say that the film, it was too dark, too subterranean and much too horrific, and say there's not an ounce of my own personal feeling in Temple of Doom. There were further ramifications as well. George Lucas had been growing frustrated with cinema sound, that there were cinemas with excellent picture quality and some with less excellent picture quality, but the sound quality of an awful lot of cinemas was not measuring up to what he wanted for his films. That he would argue that you have this brilliant John Williams score, as was often the case, and it just sounded terrible via the kind of sound systems that cinemas were employing at the time. And between this and I'd imagine a sprinkling of Star Wars as well, it moved him to create the THX sound standard, which was pretty instrumental in raising the quality of the sound we get in cinemas today. That the THX badge itself, its name derived of course from his first film THX 1138, which is a great film, but the THX badge was a mark of quality, a mark that a cinema had a standard of sound that Lucas and his company effectively endorsed. When it finally made it into cinemas, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was greeted with reviews that were pretty much on the harsh side, that they did draw attention to the fact that this was a really dark film. This was a notable tonal shift away from the original. But audiences weren't paying too much attention to it. For a movie that cost around $30 million for the negative, it would go on to gross over $300 million worldwide, at a point where that was an enormous amount of money. I know routinely it's said in box office circles now that $1 billion is the magic number. Not back then. $300 million was a stunning amount of cash. And already there was talk about doing a third Indiana Jones film as per Lucas's original plan at that that time. And Lucas actually came up with the idea of what he wanted the third film to be, which at that time was Indiana Jones and the Monkey King, whilst Temple of Doom was still in cinemas. Spielberg, notably at that stage, wasn't keen on Lucas's other idea, which was an Indiana Jones film where the MacGuffin was the Holy Grail, but perhaps the reaction to Temple of Doom may have altered his perspective on that just slightly. Certainly when they came back for the next Indiana Jones film, The Last Crusade, their lives were in better places and it was a much brighter, breezier film. Conversely, I think Indiana Jones The Temple of Doom, for all its darkness, for all the fact that it put the chills up quite a lot of people, stands aside as a really interesting 80s blockbuster movie. And yeah, I'll say, it's the kind I don't think would get easily through the system today. Thank you so much for watching this Film Stories video. If you could please subscribe to this channel and like the video, it would help us enormously. We're not a huge international conglomerate. We are just a couple of fairly balding people doing our best in trying circumstances. If you want to comment on the videos as well, please do that. Hugely appreciated.